What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. For the past 5 years, investigative journalist Byron Tau has been piecing together a secret story, how the whole of the internet and every digital device in the world became a mechanism of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and control. Now, I'm sure most of you are thinking, yeah, I know this. We all have cell phones, they have GPS trackers, my phone calls are being monitored, yada yada. Tell me something I don't know. But the truth is that our smartphones, our wearable technologies, our networked homes, our credit cards, even the tires we drive on, emit an overwhelming amount of data that reveal details about our lives, our daily habits, and most intimate behaviors that would astonish you. All of that data is being captured and is available for sale, and the US government is its biggest customer. What you're going to learn in the first hour of today's conversation is that in the years after 9/11, the US government, working with scores of anonymous companies, many scattered across bland office parks in suburban Washington, built a foreign and domestic surveillance apparatus that can peer into the lives of nearly everyone on the planet. A cottage industry of data brokers and government bureaucrats that has one directive: get everything you can, get it all. The result is something resembling a sci-fi dystopia, like an episode out of Black Mirror, and the public knows virtually nothing about it. In the second hour of our conversation, Byron and I discuss the near-term implications of this surveillance state for American democracy, personhood, and freedom. We discuss the role of TikTok and other foreign companies and actors that are able to access the same data marketplace. We discuss the role of agent provocateurs and how location-based applications can be used to foment riots and manipulate people into mobs and other forms of collective action. We also discuss the role of prominent voices on the American right and what they leave out when discussing the role of censorship in media. And most importantly, we discuss what can be done politically through legislation and regulation to restrain government agencies and private companies operating in the surveillance economy, and what you can do on a personal level to mitigate the access that these entities and actors have to your private life. If you want access to that part of the conversation, and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now, by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this profoundly enlightening and important conversation with my guest, Byron Tau. Byron Tau, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure having you on, Byron. I really enjoyed reading your book. Did I tell you that?
You did tell me that.
I did tell you, probably over email. The book is titled Means of Control: How the Hidden Alliance of Tech and Government is Creating a New American Surveillance State. And I believe it comes out right when this episode will be publishing, so people will be able to order it. I'm very excited to talk about the book. It's an incredibly timely subject, and it's one that I've really wanted to go in depth. And I believe you've been working on this book for 5 years. Do I have that right?
That's essentially right. I first got the tip that became the book sometime in 2018, but it wasn't until 2020 that I first started doing journalism on the topic. It took me a while to develop sources to understand these topics, which range from everything from advertising to social media to essentially data collection and data brokers. And so it took me a while to really wrap my arms around this story.
So how long have you been writing about or interested in the subject of government surveillance? And did you come into it from the national security side, or did you come into it from the ad or surveillance capitalism, to quote Shoshana Zuboff, side of the business?
So essentially, I started in Washington as a traditional political reporter. I had a fairly conventional career covering elections. I did a stint as a White House reporter. And around 2017, I found myself as a congressional reporter covering the Robert Mueller investigation and the side congressional investigation into the same topic of Russian interference into the 2016 election. And that's what really got me interested in national security, in law. I covered a lot of that investigation. I learned a lot of things. I covered the intelligence committees. And essentially in 2018, I got moved over to the Justice Department beat. And I didn't really know anyone. I didn't really know anything about this beat. And I started digging around for interesting stories that my colleagues weren't telling or that were being overlooked. And I stumbled into this phenomenon of governments buying large amounts of data, specifically the Department of Homeland Security. But as I would find out as I reported this book out, this is a massive phenomenon that involves all sorts of government agencies, from the military to the intelligence community to even local law enforcement.
It's an incredible story. I cannot wait to get into it. Just a few more questions on background before we get into that. Am I correct that I saw somewhere that you went to school for journalism? You also have a journalism degree?
I did. I got a master's degree in journalism from Georgetown.
Okay, so it's fair to say that you, at a relatively young enough age, you actually wanted to be a journalist. This is a career that you wanted to have. What is it that has attracted you to this field, and what do you think in your view, what is the job of a journalist?
Well, I think the job of a journalist is to provide information to people, and especially if it's information that would not otherwise be uncovered unless it was for journalists or journalism. And so what attracted me to the profession was essentially this idea that I got to be paid to dig into things and to learn things, that every day was something new. As my interests changed, I could write about those things. There are journalists covering everything from politics to economics to law to things like sports and mountaineering. There are really journalists that cover almost every topic under the sun. And that kind of intellectual range and the ability to get paid to learn was something that was really appealing to me.
Did you know that you wanted to be, I think what you do would fall within the umbrella of investigative journalism, right? I mean, did you know that this is what you wanted to do?
Yeah, so coming out of college, I knew I wanted to work in or around government or politics in some ways. And I actually moved to Washington in 2008 without much of a plan. And it was a bad time for the country. It was a bad time for the economy. And I sort of was at this crossroads. Do I want to work in government and politics, or do I want to write about it? And I did a couple of internships in Washington. Turns out I did not love working in politics. I much preferred being an outsider, an observer, someone that wasn't part of the power structure, but could report on it, could be near it, could be around it, could try to understand it as an independent observer. And that's what really attracted me towards journalism. So I went and got my master's in journalism and started working in Washington reporting.
What did you not like about working in government?
It was a personality thing for me. I think government is very important. Having good people in government is important. But for me, I'm something, I prefer throwing bricks rather than building a wall, I guess. It's a personality thing. Not everyone should be this way. Thank God there are people that enjoy, building homes and building walls. But for me, it comes more naturally to be a critic than a builder. And so that's sort of what attracted me to journalism.
So one more question before we get into the book. I saw you were at the Wall Street Journal for a long time. You've since moved on to Notice. Notice is a brand new publication. I actually was on the waiting list before they published in the last year. I think they turned on the lights in the last 12 months. What is Notice, and what do you write about there? Is it the same stuff you were writing about at the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, so Notice is a brand new publication covering politics and policy in Washington, D.C. And its primary aim is actually to train the next generation of journalists. So we run a fellowship program for early career reporters, all college graduates, but some of them are fresh out of college and some of them have a little bit of work experience, but they're all early career. And we invite them to Washington for 18 to 24 months where they report on Congress and then politics and the government agencies that make up the federal government. And we pay them a salary and they get to be around some of the best and brightest editors and political reporters. They have some mid-career folks like me. We have some senior folks who are on staff. And together we put out this publication, Notice, which is at notice.org. Notus, by the way.
Exactly. Right. I was about to say that. All right, let's get into the book. First of all, What motivated you to write this? Because as we said, there's like a 5-year project. It's incredibly meticulous. You were very detail-oriented to the point where I was also wondering whether or not someone has to be a bit OCD to actually be a good investigative journalist. What compelled you to write this and to go and to chase this story down?
Well, in the big picture, I think I was motivated by the fact that I believe that the public wasn't always being told the truth about how their technology works. By that, I mean all the ways in which these commercial services that we've all come to rely on every day, whether that's a digital service, a subscription service, the ad-supported services that underlie so much of the modern app and internet ecosystem, those services collect huge amounts of data. And as far as the public's concerned, that data is being harvested for commercial purposes. Often companies use words like anonymized to describe it. But in reality, there is this massive pipeline of data to the world's governments, and not just for benign things like transportation planning or healthcare, but in fact for things like manhunting or public safety or solving crimes or surveillance. And I thought, looking at this, that this was a story that the public was largely in the dark about, and that in some ways, governments preferred it that way, that there was an somewhat intentional plan to try to keep these data flows, the truth about where commercial data goes inside government, away from the public. And fundamentally, I don't think that's right in a democracy. I do think that consumers and voters should know how their technology is collecting data, where it's going, and how their government is using that data.
Yeah, and you did an excellent job conveying that in the book and giving many anecdotes that show how the government not only was trying to keep things secret, but learned lessons along the way. When I say the government, I mean government agencies or people working within government or people working within the private sector that were being contracted through government understood that what they were doing was something that the public was not going to like or that they wanted the public to know about, even if they thought that it might be technically legal. And we'll get into sort of the legality of this and whether or not it is and how we can assess it. What types of sources did you rely on for this in terms of documentation and then also in terms of individuals? Obviously, you can't tell us who you spoke with. What are the kinds of people that you spoke with? And typically, were the people that were higher up more useful, or were they a bit cagier and it was not necessarily those sources that were the most beneficial to helping you piece together this story?
Well, it's a good question. Let me take the question about the higher-ups versus the grunts, the rank and file. So it's not just that the higher-ups are being cagey. It's often that they don't always know the details of what's going on in agencies. They make the big picture decisions. They sign off on these things, but they don't always know how they're implemented. They don't always know every program that their agency is running. So by and large, the people I spoke to were the lawyers, the analysts, the government contractors, the people who were on the front lines designing these programs, using them, and buying this data on the open market, or building products to sell to the government. I spoke to hundreds of people. I think I did more than 300 interviews, although that sometimes I interviewed the same person more than once. And I looked at tens of thousands of documents. Lots of documents on this are actually unclassified, even though, I am describing a world in which the government doesn't want to necessarily reveal what's happening. They can't always do that, right? Because there are sometimes contracting records, and often this kind of data isn't actually classified. And so I basically pieced together this story by using public records, documents in the public domain, contracting records, things I acquired under the Freedom of Information Act, and hundreds of interviews to tell this story.
Yeah, the open source or publicly available intelligence angle to the story is fundamental to it. So look, let's get into this. I want to do something very ambitious here, which is I want to adhere pretty closely to the story that you tell in the book and have you walk us through in detail the evolution of the modern surveillance state, which relies on an active partnership between the government, these government agencies, these three-letter agencies, CIA, NSA, DHS, et cetera, and various organizations within the private industry, for-profit data acquisition, analysis, dissemination, et cetera, companies. Walk us through that story. Let's start at the very beginning. There's been surveillance going on, of one form or the other in the United States forever. Of course, there was a strict divide between foreign and domestic. When did this really kick off? The story that you tell in this book, when did it really begin?
Sure. So, as you say, spying's been going on forever. There's a joke among intelligence historians that it's the second oldest profession. And as long as there's been governments, they have tried to engage in trying to better understand the world, often through open sources, not just clandestine means, but reading each other's newspapers, sending scouts into each other's territory under false pretenses. But the story that I'm telling here about specifically the role that commercial data or consumer data, data that comes off of ordinary everyday services, started to play in government surveillance basically begins after 9/11. Here and there are some pilot programs before 9/11, but 9/11 changed the way that the government thought about intelligence. It changed the kinds of people that the government was interested in surveilling, and it fundamentally resulted in billions of dollars in new spending and new programs and new authorities that were dispersed all around the government. And so essentially I start at 9/11, that after 9/11, there is this realization that not only in the government's classified data stores, but in this whole world of corporate records, hotels, rental car records, mailbox rentals, flights, all of that information was useful in piecing together what happened on 9/11. And government intelligence folks wondered after 9/11 whether it could be useful for doing things like predicting attacks, whether it could be useful for finding ways to look for patterns or outliers or things that don't belong in large data sets. And so thus began 20 to 25 years of experimentation on how to use data that's just out there, that's captured by America's largest corporations, that's often available for sale, to do public safety, national security, and intelligence.
So you started with a company called Axium. I think that was the first company that you detailed in the book. And I think they were important because they were the originators of what we now think of as the mobile ID or the ad ID or unique identifier that ties to every single person in the world and aggregates data around that individual. Talk to me about Axium, and then let's use that to pivot into a conversation about John Poindexter and total information awareness and how that really seems to have kicked off or set the beacon for where the industry wanted to go in the early parts of the 2000s.
Yeah, so Axiom is actually, for a data broker, a fairly old company. It came out of the 1960s, and essentially it was born as a sort of a demographics company, basically. It wasn't doing anything more than what you could do by scanning the phone book. So basically it was collecting consumer records on people, often from consumer sources, but sometimes from public sources like courthouses, marriage records, that kind of thing. And it was one of a number of data brokers that were springing up in this era, mostly to help companies do direct mail. And you mentioned that they came up at some point with this idea of a stable identifier. And that was essentially for commercial purposes. It was sort of the proto ad ID because there wasn't quite mobile phones yet. But essentially what that was that if, you got married and you changed your last name, Axiom could try to use its computing power to try to match your new identity with your old identity. Or if you switch addresses, you move across the country for work, it could try to probabilistically guess that, John Smith that lived in Boston during these dates, well, that's probably the same John Smith that then moved to San Francisco on this date. Nothing that's wild and crazy in the world of today's marketers and data brokers, but it was something of an innovation. It wasn't the only company doing something like this, but they were a big company. After 9/11, they realized that they were sitting on data that could potentially tell the story in part of 9/11. One of their analysts shortly in the days after 9/11 actually ran the names of the terrorist hijackers through their database and found that a good number of them were actually present in Axiom's data. And having discovered this, they alerted the FBI, participated in several government pilot programs, and eventually became a provider of data to some of these government programs that were trying to do things like airline security or to try to keep terrorists out of the country who were on terrorist watch lists, that sort of thing.
So what was the government's interest in this kind of data, if it had any interest whatsoever, before the 9/11 attacks?
Sure. So Before the 9/11 attacks, there had been some interest in using data brokers like Axium to find sort of fugitives for justice and to do sort of people finding, the kind of stuff that investigative reporters like me do all the time, and that data brokers like Axiom and others are quite useful for. But it didn't really evolve into this full-fledged program of ingesting large amounts of this data and scanning through it for templates of behavior that suggested anomalies or patterns that could suggest that someone is doing something out of the ordinary. The interest in commercial data before 9/11 was mostly interested in just querying these databases to look for someone who had skipped bail or was skipping out on child support or something like that. So the big difference was after 9/11, there was this tremendous interest in using big data to try to identify patterns or anomalies or outliers in large data sets in a way that I don't think was at the forefront of the minds of law enforcement and public safety analysts prior to 9/11.
So at the same time as Axiom was looking at their own database and thinking about how or what they could do to help the government after 9/11, I believe John Poindexter was having a similar realization. Now, where was he working at the time? And also tell our listeners, for those who don't know who John Poindexter is or his affiliation with the Reagan administration or Iran-Contra, who is he? And then how does he fit into this story? And that'll get us into a conversation about his work at DARPA and Total Information Awareness, or TIA.
Sure. So John Poindexter was an admiral in the Navy, and eventually he rose to serve on, I believe, the National Security Council of the Reagan White House during the Iran-Contra scandal. Long story short there, he essentially has to resign in disgrace. I believe he's brought up on criminal charges that are either overturned on appeal or dismissed later. And essentially, after that, after the Reagan administration, settles into a life as a Beltway contractor, like many people in Washington. But 9/11 is what brings him back to government. And he essentially comes into government with this big, bold idea that he can build this program called Total Information Awareness that's going to essentially serve as a test bed for the government to try out all sorts of new technologies, especially around data and secure computing and linking various databases together. And part of that vision was that Poindexter hoped to take all this data out there on car rentals, on flights, on travel, even medical records in some cases, or veterinary records, or purchases on credit cards from Home Depot or other stores. He was hoping that he could take all that and put it in a giant computer database and start scanning for templates of terrorist behavior that might indicate that there is a terrorist attack being planned. So say someone rents a truck and also acquires a large amount of, say, fertilizer. Now, those things by themselves don't necessarily indicate terrorist behavior, but that is a clue that potentially somebody could be trying to build a truck bomb. So his vision for this sort of computer system was that he would try to ingest all this data and run it in some giant supercomputing environment that could look for patterns like this and then spit out leads that investigators could later go and run down.
So this was obviously, and I think this is important, and you make an effort, a good faith effort in the book to point it out in a number of occasions, that the early 2000s post 9/11 was a traumatic time for the country. People were very scared, and in particular, people in government felt responsible, whether they felt responsible because they missed it or because they don't want to be responsible for another attack. And so there was a real willingness to lean into things that would have been deemed, below board in the past. Who was raising concerns at this time about these types of initiatives, both in and outside of government? Are there any important figures that you write about that we should be thinking about in this conversation?
Well, first of all, to be fair to Poindexter himself, he actually did spend a lot of time and resources in this program to try to figure out ways to do this in a privacy protecting way. So he did think that there were ways to build privacy protections into this system that wouldn't just allow anyone to query a name. It might be able to protect the identity of the people in the data and only reveal an identity when a suspicious pattern was detected, for example. But at the time, starting around 2003 and into 2004, the political winds in Washington started to shift. And around this time, programs like John Poindexter's Total Information Awareness started to get a lot more scrutiny from members of Congress, who some might say they had been previously a little bit cowed by the public reaction after 9/11, but when Poindexter proposed this, it actually caused something of a firestorm on Capitol Hill. And the one senator that led the charge and is still sort of in the public eye is Senator Ron Wyden. But he wasn't the only one. There was actually this bipartisan group of lawmakers and others in civil society that really did not like this idea, that was not comfortable with this notion that the government would start acquiring massive amounts of data on the population, innocent people, the entire US citizenry, without some probable cause, the typical standard we associate with investigating someone for a crime or charging them with a crime. And so this was really the first program after 9/11 that Congress was uncomfortable with. Before that, they largely gave the Bush administration carte blanche on national security. They authorized the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They built the Department of Homeland Security. They spent hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending. It would ultimately total trillions of dollars in new spending after the bill was totaled over 20 years of these wars. And so total information awareness was this very interesting moment where this program became public, and there suddenly was a firestorm of civil libertarians, both on Capitol Hill and in the general public, very concerned about it. And they ultimately won a battle to essentially defund it.
So walk me through that a little bit, because this is an opportunity to also talk about the legal underpinnings that were used to justify these types of surveillance initiatives. What was the legal battle that went into this, and who were the participants? Because in the book you write about this isn't just a matter in terms of what the courts had to say, but it was also about lawyers, privacy lawyers within some of these various departments and what their assessments were. So how did the legal justifications for this come about? And maybe we can start with the Constitution itself, because I think if you ask a random American on the street about his or her right to privacy, even if he or she hasn't thought about it or doesn't really consider the question relevant, that person will have a view, will have an idea that somehow, somewhere in the Constitution, there is some mention of this, maybe in the Fourth Amendment. So what is the constitutional underpinning of our conception of our right to privacy, and how has this proceeded into law over the years, and what is the underlying justification for all of these policies that would ensue?
So the Supreme Court has been a little bit squishy on the idea of a right to privacy. Starting in the early 20th century, there started to be this notion in legal intellectual circles that there might be such a right. If you read it, if you squint hard enough at the Constitution and you take some of the amendments together, it sort of implies that citizens ought to have this zone of privacy around themselves and their papers and their stuff that the government shouldn't intrude too far into. And this right to privacy reaches its apex in the 1970s when there's a series of decisions on reproductive health and women's health, culminating in Roe v. Wade, but also another case called Griswold, that essentially says, yeah, there is this right to privacy. But as the years have gone on and the court has grown more conservative, they've been less inclined to see this abstract right to privacy in the Constitution. There's a second element here, which is the Fourth Amendment, as you mentioned. The Fourth Amendment is a privacy right to some degree. It's essentially a prohibition on the government conducting an unreasonable search of citizens.
What does the Fourth Amendment say for people that need a refresher?
Essentially, the Fourth Amendment says that you cannot conduct a search unless it's reasonable. I'm sorry, I could Google it or pull it up, but
I can cite it for you. I have it pulled up right here.
You have it in front. I just don't have it.
So, the relevant passages are the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
That's right. So the government essentially needs probable cause of a crime, generally speaking, to intrude on things that might reasonably be kept private. The problem here is that the court over the years has said that if you do something like share that information with a third party, then you lose that reasonable expectation of privacy. So this started to come up in the context of bank records, right? Or telephone calls. When you dial a number on an old-fashioned telephone, your telephone company knows who you're dialing, and it prints out a list of calls you made at the end of every month and sends it to you as part of the bill. When you engage in a financial transaction. You tell your bank who to write the check to, who to wire the money to. So the government's point of view is that when you tell a third party like a bank or the telephone company some piece of information, you actually lose your privacy right. And that has opened up this window that the government has to get information that citizens have shared with third parties with a standard less than probable cause. And that was okay back when, by and large, we all kept our important papers in a drawer in our homes. And the only things that really we're sharing with third parties are maybe telephone, the numbers we dial, not the content of the call, but the numbers we dial, and maybe some financial information. But with the rise of the digital revolution, we increasingly are giving over intimate details about our lives to some third party. Every time you start your car, if it's a new car that has one of those fancy infotainment systems, you may be sending your location to a number of companies. Every time you download a weather app, you're telling the weather app where you are if you give it 24/7 permission to serve you the weather. If you download an email client and that email client, is offering to store your emails on their server, well, they have a window into who you're communicating with. And so increasingly as time went on, as digital technology started to change the way Americans live, this window that the government had into information shared with third parties grew larger and larger.
So I want to take a moment just to remind listeners, because we've done so many shows now over the years, that we did an episode with Jeffrey Rosen of the National Constitution Center, who wrote a book on the implications of the digital realm for many of the things that we're talking about today, including personhood and privacy. So that was something in the episode 20-something, I think it was. So definitely check that out. I want to talk about the third-party doctrine, and I want to talk about Smith versus Maryland and the distinction between metadata and content that came out of the use of the pen register in that case. Before we do, I just want to wrap something up here. Is it fair to say that Justice Louis Brandeis and his law review article titled The Right to Privacy is sort of the seminal document that captures the thinking around how the Fourth Amendment translates into this sense of this idea of a right to privacy?
So I think you probably have to ask someone like Jeffrey Rosen for the true sort of legal analysis. What I can tell you is that article was influential in creating a discussion and a debate that has echoed for more than 100 years in the annals of legal history about what the right to privacy means. And today's interpretation of the right to privacy does not include data that is purchased. Now, there's some evidence that this is maybe changing a little bit, or that Congress is beginning to address this issue. But when you're talking about data that's available in an overt commercial transaction that's available on an open market, your privacy interests are essentially non-existent in that case, because you've already shared that information with some data broker or some third-party service that collected it and is making it available for sale.
No, I mean, that is like such an important point, Byron, and you do such a great job in the book of highlighting it. And I want to get into it because it really sits at the center of what has enabled the rise of this surveillance state, because so much of what the government does is buy data on the open market. It doesn't necessarily go out and get it. So I want to also understand the legal justifications for that. Let's just wrap up this point about metadata and content, because as you said, there were a number of court rulings throughout the 60s and 70s that led to this. But there was an important court ruling called Smith versus Maryland. What was that ruling, and how did it crystallize what we're talking about here?
Yep. So that ruling was essentially the court's strongest articulation of this notion of the third-party doctrine, meaning that you share information with some other party, you lose your privacy interest in it. And in that case, it was about the telephone. So government agents had put what's called a pen register on someone's phone line, and that essentially recorded all the numbers they dialed and all the calls that they received. And in that case, the court said, well, you don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy in the numbers you dial and the numbers that call you, because the phone company knows it. The phone company prints out a bill every month and sends you that bill in the mail. So, it's not secret. Anyone at the phone company knows who you're calling, and the government should not be constrained from trying to figure out if there's criminality and not have to show that you're probably committing a crime. It can do very basic investigative steps and go get your phone calls. And this inadvertently created this distinction between content and metadata, right? Because the information about who you call is metadata. It's data about data. The court didn't say that they could wiretap your phone calls without probable cause of a crime. They need to show that there's a reason to believe you're involved in criminal behavior to wiretap you, but they don't need to show that in order to go look at your phone logs. And this distinction persists to this day, that there's a much higher search burden to get the content of your emails than merely records of who you're communicating with. And it's the same thing with all manner of other modern data sets, movement, phone calls, text messages. The metadata is less protected than the content itself.
Right. It's the same reason that U.S. Postal Office can see what the addresses are on the outside of an envelope, but they can't go into the physical mail. And that might have been appropriate, 50 years ago, when there was a limited amount of information that could be derived from this so-called metadata. But today, as you've written so well in the book, not only can you geolocate someone anywhere they are, all their movements every day, you can even figure out where they are, on what side of the bed they sleep on, based on the mesh devices in the house that are all communicating over Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and they're able to triangulate within your local area network. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. So I think what's also relevant and important to point out here, and I want to point out, is that yes, there are these legal precedents, and yet technology evolves, and the implications of what we're dealing with also change. Let's take a moment now to focus in on the private sector. Again, this is something that we've talked about. I always encourage people to go to hiddenforces.io and go to the episode page for this particular episode and go to the related section under the related tab and see what we've had on before. And I'm thinking now of our episode with Shoshana Zuboff from many years ago, where we talked about this. And it was, I think she did a really wonderful job of articulating this idea of surveillance capitalism at a time that many other people weren't talking about it. Let's get into this aspect of the conversation. What are the different, because you identify 4 different parties or agents in this model. Who are they? And let's break them all down. And how do they come together to create this private economic network that makes available all this data that the United States government and its agencies in turn use in order to surveil its population?
Yeah, so it's actually more of a chronological grouping. So I identify essentially 4 different generations of data brokers who came forward with different kinds of data at different times. The oldest generation is what we talked about, Axios. These were data brokers who were getting things that today I think everyone sort of understands is out there. Names, addresses, some basic consumer preferences. They would often get that from things like magazine subscriptions. So did you subscribe to Dog Fancy or Golf Pro, right? You can infer things about consumers based on that kind of thing. That was the first generation of data brokers. Then as things on the internet became much more social, as Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and later TikTok and Snapchat became popular, data brokers sprung up to understand what people were saying on these platforms, right? So you saw a rise in data brokers brokering social data, literally the raw data from social media, things like who is connected to who. Brokers sprung up to give advertisers and later governments, as my book documents, access to that kind of data. Then as mobile phones became a bigger and bigger piece of everyone's lives, data brokers sprung up to do mobile analytics, to serve ads to people, to be able to link their mobile identity with their real world identity, to derive insights from what apps people put on their phone. So I call those sort of mobile advertising data brokers, or location was the primary data set to come off of those, though there are other data sets. And finally, the final generation, I call it gray data, essentially. And it's essentially logs of things that people don't even really think about. And this is where it gets really strange and esoteric, but there exist brokers out there that say they're vacuuming up all the Wi-Fi signals of all the base stations around the world, or they're putting little software packages on millions of phones around the world and looking at where Bluetooth headphones appear at certain times, or car tires. Many people don't know this, but your car tires broadcast a wireless signal, and they have a unique identifier. There are data collection companies that have started to put up things on the top of cell towers or light poles in cities all around America to capture the identifiers of car tires. So as time has gone on, things have gotten stranger and more esoteric to collect large amounts of data that the average person doesn't even conceive can be collected.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's an anecdote in the book. You do this both with the Easy Pass, which is kind of obvious to people, right? I mean, at least they know that you go through a toll and that the Easy Pass is red, but they don't realize that same technology, I think it uses RFID. Is that what it uses?
It uses some sort of it uses some sort of radio frequency signal.
If you have the right device, you can capture this information anywhere that the car is traveling. And the same thing is true for these tire signals. I don't think you mentioned ad exchanges. I mean, you talk about them in the book. They're really important. Because what's also amazing about ad exchanges is they're a great place to find tons of data that you don't even have to pay for just by participating in the exchange. So talk to me a little bit about this really important platform of an ad exchange. How does it work? And how is it used in order to get all of this data basically for free?
Yeah, so this falls into that third bucket of data brokers that I was talking about. So essentially mobile and location data brokers. And essentially an ad exchange is a place where people who have money to spend on advertising come. It's a technological service. It's a server, essentially. And it essentially connects the buyer of ad space with open ad space on millions and billions of devices around the world. And it exists to facilitate the serving of those tiny little display ads that are annoying and they show up in all manner of apps. And that's how a lot of the modern internet is paid for. And these exchanges are run by companies that often you've never heard of and you have no direct consumer relationship with. But trust me, their code is running on your phone. And those exchanges, if they're in an app that has access to GPS location, well, you've told the app that it's okay to collect your GPS location. And so the exchange will collect it as well because it wants to serve you a geographically relevant ad in some cases. The problem with these ad exchanges is that they bring together thousands of parties who want to serve ads on one platform and expose your data to all of them. And I got to tell you, not all of those thousands of entities are trustworthy. Many of them are just lurking there and saving the data and putting it in a giant database, and some of those people are selling data to the government. And these ad exchanges have really no way to police it and no real incentive to do so unless an annoying journalist like me calls up and says, I've identified a conduit of your data flowing to the Department of Defense. And then they say, oh, okay, well, we've shut that down and it's against our terms of service. But it's no exaggeration to say that almost every internet-enabled or internet-connected device in some way, shape, or form is plugged into these ad exchanges and is passing some sort of information back to them. And it's probably no exaggeration to say that every country with a sophisticated cyber operation has found some way, shape, or form to lurk and collect data on these ad exchanges.
So let's say I'm part of some intelligence division within the People's Liberation Army, and not to pick on them, we're just picking one sort of major international actor. And I show up on this ad exchange purporting to be a company interested in advertising. What information am I actually getting? Am I getting the mobile IDs of every single individual that is actually actively using an app? And I'm constantly getting what along with that? What additional information is that giving me? And is that something I'm able to do participate in this real-time bidding process all the time to get the most up-to-date information for free, as we're talking about here?
Yeah. So generally what happened if you were an entity affiliated with the People's Republic of China's military intelligence branch is that they would find some commercial reason to be on this ad exchange. They'd set up a contractor or some sort of commercial company that has no outward-facing relationship to the government and say, I'm a company that would like to serve ads to people around the world, and they get on one of these or maybe all of these ad exchanges because there's only a finite number of them. And then they essentially, in order to remain a member of good standing, they generally should serve some ads, although sometimes you could just lurk for many years at a time. Some of them even license their data to entities like this. And you will see a ton of information about global devices on this ad exchange. It'll be just a giant, enormous fire hose of data. Not all of it will contain GPS location. Much of that is dependent on what permissions user enables on their phone, but in some way, shape, or form, the phone will pass things back. Often that will be IP. Often that will be the mobile ad ID. That's a persistent, unique identifier that's supposedly anonymized, but really can often be linked back to your real-world identity. It could include very strange technical information about the phone, such as what languages your keyboards are in, and what screen resolution your screen is in. In some cases, sometimes developers get access to what other apps are on the phone, depending on how the phone is configured. In some cases, even your gyroscope, which direction you're facing, your battery level, all that could, in theory, be passed back to an ad exchange, depending on how the developer and how the ad exchange configures all their technology. And that is tremendously valuable cyber data, right? Because often you don't need someone's name or their phone number to start making real inferences about who they are in the real world. Often all you need is an IP address. All you need is where the phone sleeps at night. And so there's a tremendous amount of valuable data that is just sitting on these exchanges. And of course, governments are going to be interested in it. It was naive to believe that you could build such a system that connected every computer and phone on Earth with an ad server and not attract the interest of deep-pocketed governments.
So again, there's a lot of data you can get from participating in these bidding processes. There's also data you can buy. What about data you can get by running your own application or putting lines of code through an SDK into another third-party application? What's done there? How is data extracted in that manner? And how is data used by the United States, China, North Korea, Russia, et cetera, through these methods?
Yep. So developers often rely on code written by other people, often to do analytics, sometimes to get a little money by collecting users' location data. And of course, governments have figured this out too. So often government-linked contractors will build SDKs and try to get them into phones. Often they're collecting geolocation, but sometimes they're doing some very strange things, right? I found at least 2 examples of companies collecting Wi-Fi or cell phone or other wireless information through millions of distributed phones around the world. So that means people that downloaded these random apps thinking that they just wanted, a free remote app or a free game actually were running signal collection software in the background of their phone.
I want you to explain that one because I think, because there are a lot of stories in the book, a lot of anecdotes like this. I think this is the one that I found the most surprising and cleverest, which is that there used to be a device, I cannot remember what it was called. What's the name for it that used to be used where you could walk around, go to the back of a plane and collect information? You used to actually have to have a dedicated device for this. Now you can just have a phone running a third-party application. The person that's using the phone doesn't even know it, and that person is scooping up information about neighboring devices that's getting sent back to the server that's collecting all that data, and that server could be in Pyongyang or in Beijing or in Moscow or at the NSA's headquarters in Washington.
Yep, that's right. So there used to be these devices. I name one in the book called a Nemo Handy, but there were actually a bunch of other manufacturers made things like this. The special government devices that would do what's called a wireless survey, which means they could covertly monitor all the signals around the phone. This all started actually originally with like giant briefcases and things you'd stick on drones, and then they got it down to putting it in a handset. But eventually people realized, hey, we could just code this and distribute it along with commercial software all around the world and just put some vague notice in the privacy policy that, hey, we may look at Bluetooth and wireless information around your device for analytics and other purposes. So yeah, essentially, at least 2 companies were doing this. One was a company called Premise Data. They were looking at cell towers and Wi-Fi base stations. And another company called Xmode Social was partnered with a company called Signal Frame, and they were distributing a SDK in apps around the world that would monitor Bluetooth devices. Look at all the little wireless and Bluetooth signals around millions of devices and try to map them out where they appeared. And, this starts to look a lot more like government signal gathering than true commercial intelligence. Of course, there's some commercial purpose to this, right? Because Signal Frame had pitched itself and its product as a way to, maybe count the number of Fitbits in the world or Apple Watches and, make some market determination from that. But of course, there's this surveillance potential too. And that was what ended up attracting government attention as well.
So I don't know how old you are, Byron. I think you're about 10 years younger than me. No, it's not true. You graduated in 2008, so maybe we're not that far apart. But you and I, you probably remember growing up in an America that wasn't this militarized, where you didn't walk around everywhere and feel like you're some kind of, prisoner in an open air prison with tanks rolling around and high, capacity guns and body armor of police. I mean, the idea of seeing a policeman in a tank is something that's really radically new. I mean, it's been around for the last 20 years or so. This, I think, paralleled the rise of the post 9/11 world with these wars, all the funding that went to the Pentagon, to private contractors, and this industry of companies producing all this hardware that then had to get utilized somehow, whether it was getting redeployed back to the United States or whether excess capacity was getting created for local police departments. But you had basically what was initially created in the military realm going down to local police departments and being deployed on the streets of America. It feels like something similar has happened here, that the technology that was being deployed and used to target dissidents or jihadists out somewhere in Yemen or Oman has now found its way back into the United States. Is that an unfair assessment?
No, that's entirely fair. That's actually a theme that recurs throughout my book, that in a lot of these cases, things that were developed for the military's use in one context would quickly end up with the local police department. And, no disrespect to the local police departments, but the military and the intelligence agencies actually operate under a staggering amount of paperwork and legal supervision. They are not, by and large, in the United States, rogue agencies. That doesn't mean everything they're doing is perfect, but it does mean there is a high level of scrutiny on the things they're doing, at numerous levels. Local police are different, right? Because, there's more than 10,000 different police departments in the United States. Some are professionally run, very well managed, very well overseen. Others are not. Others are very small, do not have compliance and civil liberties departments, often have no more than a few officers or a few dozen officers. And so when you take a tool that was developed for a war zone or was developed for the military and put it in the hands of a local police department who is aiming that tool at the United States, not outside the United States as the military or the intelligence community was, you're talking about a whole different set of privacy calculations. And you're also talking about citizens who have the right to see evidence against them, to understand how the government is doing things, how they catch criminals. We do all that out in the open in the United States. We don't have, secret tribunals. We don't have, except under extraordinary circumstances, we don't have closed-door court hearings. And so there is just a different set of concerns and calculations when you're talking about law enforcement and local law enforcement specifically than when you're talking about the national security establishment.
So, it's a great point about paperwork, and it's a great way to bring us back to the Fourth Amendment, because the Fourth Amendment puts a huge burden on law enforcement to build a case, to go to a judge, to get that judge to issue a warrant, build a case for probable cause, that is to say, to get a warrant, to be able to search your suspect and try and get the information you need to build a case. I guess my question is, how many of these tools are being used by police departments, and not just in parallel, not just in order to complement existing police work, but actually to replace that police work entirely? I mean, do we see that, for example, in the number of warrants issued? Are there fewer warrants issued in 2023 or 2022 than there were relative to the number of cases or suspects or population than 20 years ago? Is there some way to measure that?
It's very hard to get comprehensive criminal justice data. I'm sure someone with enough money and computing power could maybe get the answer to that question. But what I can tell you is that sometimes these law enforcement agencies are using this data in sneaky or surreptitious ways. And I have some very specific examples in the book, specifically the case of a drug tunnel that led from the Mexico side of the US border to a restaurant on the US side. From what I could tell, the government had seen mobile devices in this location data set crossing at a place where there was no official border. That raised questions to them about whether there was a tunnel there. And so essentially they arrested the occupant of the restaurant and did a dog sniff of his car at a traffic stop and found drugs. And nowhere in the court documents did it ever mention that they had used this data set, this surveillance tool. And indeed, some of the vendors whose contracts I obtained under the Freedom of Information Act actually say that the police are never allowed to put in a court document that they've used this location tracking tool. Partially because these companies actually can't vouch for where the heck this data came from to begin with, but partially to keep it on the down low from the citizens who might otherwise either object or not use their devices in certain ways while they commit crimes. Now, maybe that's what we want as a society, but it should be a conversation we have openly, not something that's done covertly or surreptitiously.
So I'm going to move us to the second hour, Byron. Before I do, I want to pull a quote from your book that actually speaks exactly to what you're saying now. And it goes back to John Poindexter and total information awareness. And the quote is this: "The lesson the intelligence community and the Defense Department took away from the fiasco," this fiasco was the PR fiasco around TIA, around total information awareness, took away from this fiasco was that bad branding, congressional politics, and a misguided attempt at transparency nearly doomed what was otherwise a useful program. They would wise up. Going forward, these projects would be incubated in the anonymous office parks of suburban Washington by faceless, nameless bureaucrats and low-profile contractors. They would be cloaked in non-disclosure agreements or hidden in classified contracts. The dream of total information awareness would never die. Byron, I'm going to move us to the second hour, and this is where I want to have a larger philosophical conversation, because a lot of what we're talking about here, when it's merged with the kind of predictive analytics and computing power that we have today, looks like it could build something like a Minority Report. I mean, it's already doing that, but we could move into a system and into a place in society where increasingly that is what things look like. And by Minority Report, I mean the movie with Tom Cruise where precogs, these sort of like genetically engineered or mutated human beings, were able to predict the future, and simply their word was the law, And so it feels like there's a real risk of that happening. And that's one philosophical conversation I want to have with you, because it's also what I had with Jeffrey Rosen. I also want to discuss politics and the political implications of all of this. Also, it seems to me that this surveillance topology shares a lot in common, or the sort of the incentive structure and the game theory that operates within it shares a lot in common with what we've seen in the cybersecurity realm, where in cybersecurity, and we've had Bruce Schneier on the show multiple times, who I know you quote in the book, one of the things that he talks about is how the intelligence agencies are incentivized not to patch software, even if they know that foreign adversaries are using it, are exploiting systems that Americans are using because they're using the same vulnerabilities. And so there's something similar going on here, it seems, with the surveillance state and the desire to maintain all of these sort of private sector data pools, because our surveillance institutions, our intelligence agencies are using them just like the foreign ones are. It's something else I want to talk to you about and what that means in terms of sort of what are we, sort of the collateral damage of this war that's going on between intelligence agencies. I want to talk about TikTok also, because it fits in the conversation about applications, and it's been something that people are talking a lot about. I think it's important, but obviously it's not as important as the bigger picture, which you've done a great job writing about in this book. And I also want to end on solutions and ways forward and ways for us to respond. Socially, which I think you'll agree, there is no substitute for social solutions, because if enough people are opting into the system, nothing you can do as an individual will make you safe. But there are things that we can as individuals do, and you write about some of those things in the book, and that's what I want to get into in the conversation as well. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener-supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Byron, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Byron, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.